Longevity is a subject of interest to, more than passing interest to most of us. And of course, the idea is to live a long life and a good life. Startling new information and research has been received just in the last year or two on that subject. I know you all don't want to live 140 years as a vegetable, but you want to live 140 years. And as some men may say, they would like to be shot by a jealous husband when they do demise. Whenever that is. But it is fascinating to find out what this extremely brilliant biochemist, researcher has developed. And that's what Nanette Christ Johnson is to deliver to you this morning. The results of that research and what can be accomplished in such a simple manner. And she'll explain all that to you. Her part of the presentation is video clips, so make sure you're in a position where you can hear or where you can see the video as they're played for you. I think you're going to find it another very fascinating subject for your own personal enlightenment and pleasure. Welcome, Nanette Christ Johnson from Virginia Beach, Virginia, this morning, please.
Thank you, Dean. If anyone can't hear me in back, just give me one of these.
I think it's a little, needs
Can't
to be
hear
a
me?
little louder.
Can you turn it up?
Closer.
He's turning it up now.
Thank you. Now can you hear me? Is that good? Okay, we're going to change the vibration on the microphone for you.
Let me go straight down with this thing. Oh dear.
While he's doing that, there was some kind of a meter here that Steve had while Drew was on, or Andrew had, and it changed as Drew walked back and forth across the stage. Just forgot to mention that to you. Okay, we got you?
Okay, are we all set now? Can everyone hear me? I'd like to bring in the highest frequency possible into this room, since you've all learned now about frequency and vibration, and the highest frequency word is God. So I want to say a brief prayer and meditation before we begin. Our Heavenly Father, Mother God, beloved I Am Presence, we call upon you to come to us here and give us your guidance, bring us the enlightenment and all the gifts that you wanted us to have throughout history. We pray at this time that each one will dissolve all fears or misconceptions that they may have had so that they can understand your higher truth and your greater love for us. We thank you also for the gift that we're about to receive, the gift of longevity, the gift of enlightenment. And we pray that each one here will find themselves worthy of accepting it. These things we pray and thank you. In the name of all that is sacred, amen. To introduce some of my background will help you to understand how I came to find this formula. At age 7, I decided to be an artist. At that time, my mother was an artist, and I came from generations of others before. Also from people that I would call spiritually open, meaning clairvoyant, clairaudient, able to perceive other dimensions. By the time I was 12, I was doing portraits professionally. When I was 21, I had spent some years doing spiritual practices of meditation, prayer, special diet, studies of world religions, and so forth. And at age 21, I had an illumination experience with God. This was an experience where I not only was in what scientists would call a superconductive state, but in the white light for a period of 3 days. And I went deeper within that light, and I found that there is a center of being, which we call the God presence. And within this being was the potentiality for all other beings. And while communicating with this being and hearing the being communicate back to me, I was told, I am that I am that I was, I am that I am that I will be. And so that you can all hear this, I'll ask that the microphone be turned up a little bit louder.
That's not possible.
All right.
We're at the edge of feedback.
If anyone else can't hear, please move forward. There's plenty of seats up here.
You have to speak louder.
Okay, I'll talk as loud as I can. I'm not a person who has a loud voice. Can I hold it? Thank you. So while I was experiencing the God presence, is that better? I was in the state of the white light for 3 days, and I saw this exquisite being that some people call the great central sun. And before I saw this being, I had a million questions, but after I experienced the being, all my questions were answered at that time. I was like Parsifal, who found the Holy Grail, but I was also young and didn't have the richness of life's experience to wonder at that point about other things, like, if I'm experiencing this bliss and I'm in this ocean of love, is the God presence always blissful? And as I experienced the white light for the next 3 days, I began to see that within each person was a micro copy of this God being. Some people call it the God particle. But there was a longing within the God presence to be connected to each and every one of the other people. And as your previous speaker said, most of us are on UHF and God is on VHF. And so we don't ever have any communion with our God presence. And at that time I thought, it's so simple. I wish I had thought and felt this before. It was so simple. Everything that was ever beautiful and ever good that I had felt before, experienced before, was coming from this God presence. Now, after that, I became more clairvoyant and clairaudient than I had been before. I could hear the other dimensions and see the other dimensions. I was in a state of timelessness. Many of you just heard about time travel. While I was in that state for 3 days, I was able to wonder about anything at any time and be present there immediately. There was no time. And I knew that while we were in embodiment, it was possible to sustain our lives and sustain our consciousness in this state. And the God presence said to me, you are at this moment perfect and are to become perfect. And I wondered about that for a little while and later realized that if I stayed in that state of consciousness, in that state of heart, I would be perfected. And it's our destiny, each one of us, to be in that state of consciousness and to experience that joy and that ecstasy throughout our lives. Now, we know that throughout biblical history and throughout many traditions, even in mythology, the patriarchs of old lived to be thousands of years in age. And the gods were described as having lived to be thousands of years old, in good health. So what is it that has happened to mankind that cut them off from this ability, not only to communicate with the God presence, to bring in what I would call the white light, or the superconductive field that enables us to regenerate our bodies, our minds, and our spirits? Being cut off from the Creator was part of the problem. We don't have time today to go into the reasons for that. But we could say that we all know that there is the universal fall stories. And it was through the misuse of our creative forces, misdirection of our creative forces, that we came into a state that was separate from our highest potential. Mankind was originally in a state where there was no disease. Wondering about these things, I eventually attracted into my life those experiences that answered these questions. And I'm sure many of you have. The stories of the Holy Grail, as many of you have seen with Indiana Jones, that have lived throughout the centuries, and the story of the Count de Saint-Germain, who lived to be over 250 years old, as it's recorded in the documents of the royal courts of Europe. In the 1700s, the Count Saint-Germain was recorded to have lived in most of the countries of Europe and advised kings and queens. He was a master alchemist and adept. There is a book by Isabel Cooper Oakley that I have on our table in the back, and you're welcome to look at it or order it, and it has those documents about him. Prince Karl of Hesse said he was the man who never died. And he always remained young looking, as if he was about 40, no matter how old he got. His actual mission for Europe during the 1700s was to create a United States of Europe centered upon God, so that there wouldn't have to be any wars and conflict and struggle that was going on, and ultimately the revolutions that occurred. But the kings and queens were much more interested in Saint Germain's ability to transmute lead into gold, or to take flaws out of diamonds, or to heal their sick troops and things like that. They were interested in the phenomena rather than in what he had to say about more important matters. So he eventually was part of the reason that America was founded. Saint Germain was reputed to have possessed the Philosopher's Stone and the Elixir of Life. And there are eyewitnesses' accounts which describe this elixir as having been a mysterious fluid that looked dark in one modality and emitted light in another modality, and when it was uncorked, it started to dissipate. So the people that got a hold of it, who were trying to assassinate him at the time, couldn't do anything with it. I've worked in a number of different fields throughout my life, and my agreement with God was I would go wherever I was sent or needed if there wasn't someone else there who was ready, willing, and able to do the job. So besides visionary art, I've also worked in politics and run campaigns for both political parties, both state and national. I've been a state artist. I've worked in economic development. I was a state film commissioner. And so many things that I don't even have time to get into all of them today. I learned how to write law when I needed to, for the Senate. How did this happen? It wasn't because I spent a lot of time getting degrees. The God presence can come in and teach us whatever we need to know, when we need to know it. We can be connected to all knowledge throughout history. And each and every one of you can do that if you train yourselves and if you open yourselves to that potential. But my first love was visionary art, and I always continued to do that throughout all of the 25 years of my adult life. Although I'm much older than 25 years, I will say my career. You can see some of the paintings in the back of the room that I've done, and those are paintings of spiritual persons that I've experienced. Many of you are familiar with the painting of Jesus. I had a vision of him in 1985. It was unexpected, and he appeared to me and asked that I paint his portrait. And after discussing this with him, he kept a hologram image. He sent an emissary, actually, to keep a holographic image of himself in front of my canvas. So I just had to make it from 3D to 2D. And I learned as a visionary to discern the difference between holographs and real beings. That painting took 3 days to do. And it was done on Easter Sunday. Normally it would have taken 3 weeks to do a painting like that. After the painting was published, it went out throughout the world, and we had a number of people reporting near-death experiences with Jesus who had seen him and said he looked just like that. Eventually, the Catholic Church officials came to me and confirmed that they had taken a picture I had done from vision of Jesus and Mother Mary to their visionaries at Medjugorje in Colorado and South America. And in all three places, their visionaries confirmed that this is how Jesus and Mary looked to them. So when I hear somebody say, well, maybe it's a government conspiracy and they're projecting holographs to manipulate people of Jesus and Mary, well, let's think about that. For thousands of years, people have seen Jesus and Mary before there was any United States government technology. It's true that the spiritual dimensions do have the technology to project holographs, and I think Mary's appearance in the Coptic Church is an example of that happening. But when one of these spiritual beings comes to me, they bring in only light, only goodness, only love, and you know them by their fruits. But I always ask questions to discern who it is that I'm seeing. And that was what happened in 1986 when I asked to see the Count Saint-Germain to do a commissioned portrait of him. I had done a previous painting of Saint-Germain, which was done from what I would call the records of the past, or looking at a holographic videotape of past history. And in order to confirm that I had an accurate vision of him, I wrote to all the organizations connected to him to see if anybody had a portrait of him done during his lifetime. And indeed, there was one organization that had a small picture of him, which is a miniature, held by his disciples all this time, which was done during his lifetime. And the picture that I had sketched in meditation looked just like the painting that I was sent. So I knew I was on the right track. But when I was commissioned to do him again, I wondered why I was supposed to paint him a second time. I came down with a case of something like influenza. My mother had lit a candle in the dining room. She comes running out and says to me, I just lit a blue candle in our dining room and it's glowing violet. And the room is glowing violet and the candles turned violet. And she says, do you think Saint Germain might be here? So I came in the room and sure enough, Saint Germain was there. And he gave messages for members of my family and for myself, indicating that he would help with the portrait that was going to be painted. Later on, he appeared to me in my studio. And I wanted to know, because I test the spirits, how did I know he was the right Count Saint-Germain? And he laughed and he said, you can ask anything you'd like. I said, not only do I want an answer to my question, I also want verification for the answers to my questions. So I asked him, how did you live to be over 200 years old and look like you were 40? And he said, besides the things that I was already aware of, his spiritual practices, his special diet, and so forth, that he did 3 other things. One of them was he showed me a beautiful blue-green water plant. I said, is that algae? And he said, yes. And it's a special species of algae that I don't believe was on the market at that time. He said, but you'll be shown it soon. And about a year later, someone did come in with this liquid brain food. And I knew as soon as I held it, that's what Saint Germain had taken. It was super blue-green algae. The second thing he said was that he had a form of consumable oxygen that he utilized. At that time, there was no one I knew of who had oxygen like that. And the third thing was his elixir. So I said to him, can you tell me about your elixir and how you made it? And he chuckled and said, you don't have the scientific knowledge, even though my father was a scientist, to be able to comprehend all of it. But he did say that while he was exploring the photosynthesis process and how sunlight is converted into energy, he discovered the secret of life. And he discovered the secret of regeneration. And that he had developed his elixir from that process. So I asked him, how did you remove the flaws from the diamonds for the kings and queens? He said, I didn't, I grew new ones. Well, more information came through on those subjects over a period of time. And this is the finished portrait. He took me into another dimension to show me a violet fire reservoir. This print isn't quite the same as the original, but there was every shade of purple and violet, and this reservoir was like a vat as big as an entire planet. And he said, this is the reservoir of energy that we use to transmute negative thoughts or misqualified energy into positive, creative, healing forces. And we can draw on that color anytime we want, or that reservoir of energy. Now, I asked Saint Germain when he appeared to me, would he please work with another scientist in our time to redevelop his elixir for the sages? Because right now, we're on what I would call a prolonged course of restoration. And I knew there was a number of sages in the earth that it would be great if we could keep them here a little longer. So he agreed that he would work with a scientist in 1985 to redevelop his formula. Well, it took another 5 years for me to find this scientist. I was getting impatient, and I said, please send him quickly. Eventually, he spoke at a public meeting in a previous Global Science Conference. For the sake of our discussion, I'll call him Dr. G. I was not at that conference, but he was invited by a prominent family that I knew to come and speak to scientists and doctors in the state where I was from. As soon as I saw him, I thought, he even sounds like Saint Germain. He has the same accent, he came from the same part of the world, he looked similar, and I knew Saint Germain was working with him. And he talked about how he had discovered the secret of life and unlocked these scrolls, and how the macrocosm was made and how the microcosm was made, and many other things. So I asked to talk to him privately, and I said, is your formula that you're using for healing unstable? Does it absorb light in one modality and emit light in another modality, white light? And he said, yes. How did you know that? And I said, Saint Germain told me about this, Count Saint Germain. And this was a spiritually enlightened scientist, so he was able to accept that. And I said, do you have a form of consumable oxygen? He said, oh yes, that's just a byproduct of my cold fusion process. He said, I've given it to the Mayo Clinic and other clinics to heal wounds and to stop hemorrhage and so forth. So I said, well, could we get some of that? And certainly. Almost any question I asked him about anti-gravitation, about lighter than plastic metals that are indestructible, he handed them to me, let me test them. He had already done all these things. And he had learned how to take flaws out of diamonds and grow new diamonds. So the first thing we do is test all the formulas. I want to give you a little bit of background on Dr. G so you'll understand about this incredible man. He was born of a Christian and Jewish parentage, and he was imprisoned in a concentration camp as a youngster. One of his own relatives had turned him in. He held no resentment about that experience and came to this country. He was sponsored by a very prominent family here, found out that because of his brilliance, they were probably using him for purposes that he didn't agree with, so he left. He got 2 PhDs in physics and other subjects, and he also acquired hundreds of patents. He developed a cold fusion process back in the 60s that was reproducible cold fusion, and our government classified it. He went on national TV to get it declassified. What happened then was that he was called before a closed Senate hearing, and he collapsed during that hearing. He survived cyanide poisoning. He left this country to go to Europe, feeling more comfortable elsewhere. And while he was there, he learned how to grow diamonds synthetically. He expanded further on the processes that he had developed. And then he was put in a Russian gulag, Soviet communist gulag, I should say. He was left in a little box for, I believe, 18 months in solitary confinement. But what most people would consider to have been a curse, this man made a blessing. He learned how to project himself into the other dimensions during that time. So he could go out into the cosmos and go through time and bring back information that was a benefit to humanity. Again, I say, as far as I can tell, he holds no resentment over these things that happened to him. But instead, he learned from them and he grew beyond them. I know of no other scientist in this country that has been through as much persecution and difficulty as this man. Even with his more recent findings in the last, I've known him 15 years now, a little over that, I asked him, when did you discover your first discovery about how to regenerate life and the secret of life? He said in 1985. And that was when I'd asked St. Germain to work with someone else. And he said, I always knew someone was working with me too. And now he knows who it is. It took another 5 years for him to even begin to offer his formulas. What had happened was, after he was in Europe, going through all the things he went through, he got heart disease and cancer. He came back to America actually to die. And he wanted to be near his wife's family. One night, he had left his house to go out and pray on the desert. And he asked God to take him or give him the tools for his mission, because everything he'd done had been frustrated. And while he was praying, he said he knew that his prayer was going to be answered. He left a brew out on the desert that he was experimenting with, which had plant genetic material and some of his cold fusion process and other things. And it had been baking for 6 months in the sun. And the next morning he went and poured off the rinse water, and these little microcrystals came out. The microcrystals, he discovered, had captured the life force or the solar energy. Many of you may be aware that there's a thing called a neutrino, and we're missing 40% of the neutrinos that we should be getting. And these little neutrinos were captured in these microcrystals. And these crystals have the ability to regenerate life itself. They're like a little solar battery for our body. But not only are they for our body, they also assist in bringing in what mystics call the white light, what scientists call a superconductive field or scalar waves or whatever you want to call it. It's the universal prime force, the chi, the prana. So he had found a way to capture this force in a usable form in the physical world. First thing he did was heal himself of heart disease and cancer. And then he offered it to a number of other people. And doctors throughout the world are using his formulas successfully today. I cannot make any medical claims here from the podium, but I can tell you this: over the last 10 years, I've been to see a lot of these doctors, and I've sent people to doctors in other countries who have used his formula, and it is the most amazing thing that we've ever experienced. I've worked in holistic health for 25 years and have been a consultant for organizations like the Heritage, who have manufactured the Casey remedies for the last 26 years. And I haven't seen anything that approaches what this can do. Now, it took another 10 years for him to develop a formula that was okay for us to bring in an oral form here in America and market in America. The FDA originally had given him some trouble over legal entanglements, I guess they were afraid the pharmaceutical industry might get bankrupt. But he even offered it to the pharmaceutical industries as long as they wouldn't exploit it. At this point in time, as far as I'm aware, we're the only ones who are able to offer the formula in an oral form. If anybody wants any of his other forms and they have a healing crisis, they need to go to other countries for his other formulas. But eventually, I think we'll have it here in America too. I want to tell you a little bit about this elixir and how it's made, because I know some of you are interested in the scientific aspects of it, but I won't get real technical with you. In order to understand how this formula is made, we have to understand what Dr. G discovered about how life itself is created. And later on, I'll show you on the videotapes how the Sumerians had on their seals pictures of how the so-called gods created life. I look at that as the angels who assisted God in creating life on earth. But let's remember there are two kinds of angels, at least. Those that are from God and the fallen angels. So there are miscreations in the earth today, and some people will say those are from the lower ETs or whatever. That's fine if you want to call it that. And then there are those that are really part of heaven's creation. But there was originally, according to Dr. G, when God said, "Let there be light," there was an explosive force that went out into the cosmos. And in order to curb that force, black holes were created. This brings the force back into circulation so that it doesn't keep constantly expanding as the universe. And these black holes regenerate light into matter. He even describes how the forces begin to coalesce in clockwise and counterclockwise directions, interlocking at 45 degrees. And then they coalesce again and form what he calls nuclear wells. These nuclear wells, if you look at them from above, look like a Star of David. They have a six-pointed star, and in the center there's a seventh point. That forms an anti-gravitational force field, like a cone. The anti-gravitational force field, for those of you that are mystics, we're talking about multidimensional, other dimensional force fields. Now, taking it that far, Dr. G discovered that he could reproduce this effect that occurs in the microcosm under his microscope. And when he did this, he found out that through the anti-gravitational force fields and through the use of these little microcrystals, these living crystals he had developed, he was able to find or rediscover the way to reproduce life or to recreate life. Scientists have been wondering, what is it that makes the lizard's tail grow back after it's broken off, or the sharks, or some animals that can regenerate parts of the body? It's because they have what's known as smart proteins. And the proteins are the source of regeneration. These smart proteins are also now called black proteins. Well, when Dr. G took the living crystals, he stacked them up. After purifying them, he stacked them up like eggs in a carton in superlattice work. And they began to exchange energy and set up a superconductive field of free energy. Free energy, as most of you know, is limitless energy, self-replicating, self-reproducing energy. Now, several years ago, he offered a formula based on that much of his research. But he has gone far beyond that now. The next thing that happened was he discovered that when combined with human genetic material, these little proteins stacked up in a certain formation set up what is known as a bioenergy machine or a cosmic incubator. Yeah, I'm going to show you that on a videotape in a little while, and you'll see what it looks like under the microscope. It's one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. When I painted Saint Germain, I saw him with something like a Maltese cross on his chest, and I wondered why I saw that. I knew it was a sacred symbol. Many of the sacred symbols have been misused by the dark side by being turned a little bit. But this was a holy, sacred symbol. And the bioenergy machines look like the Maltese cross. To explain to you in scientific terms, they have two similar to dish antennas on either end, and on the other sides they have two bell jars connected in the center. If you take them apart and look at the center, inside it looks like a pyramid. And for those of you that are interested in sacred geometry, one side of this pyramid opens up. If you look at the top of a pyramid, you see that the angles form an equal cross. And one side of this pyramid opens up and forms a circle where the opening is, or the aperture. And out of this aperture comes the black proteins, and also a liquid form of the black proteins, which is the elixir. Dr. G explains that these black proteins are like the black holes for our bodies. They are the thing that regenerates and recycles matter and light. I want to say right at this point, if there's anybody here that doesn't want to live to be older and in good health, that they should just leave right now. Because I'm going to tell you how that can happen. The scientists and doctors who have worked with this formula have told us that they expect it to at least double our lifespan in good health. And how it does that, it's not just a matter of changing your energy field physically, it's a spiritual change too. One of the best parts about this is that it brings enlightenment to the people who take it. I've had some people who have seen auras spontaneously on the second time that they've taken a dose of this. Others get rid of aches and pains. It drives up your HDL levels so you clear out the arteries and the plaque. Feeds the cells with GTP or ATP, the cell sugars and the cell foods that you need to replicate the cells. The black proteins that are the basis of this formula are energy rich. They regenerate life at the cellular level and multidimensional level. They also are the precursors, he says, of our ancestral beings. They're super intelligent. And he discovered that there was a species dormant within us that our mitochondria is a degenerate form of. And within this part of our cellular structure, we originally were programmed as a species to be able to protect ourselves from any kind of disease or invasion of foreign materials that were not beneficial to us. And he was able to resurrect these little microbes in us that keep us disease-free. That was something he discovered more than 10 years ago. But with the elixir, over a period of time, we automatically develop this ability, and our bodies not only regenerate, but increase in immunity to disease. The bioenergy machines replicate life, and people want to know, well, how in the world can they do that? He says they replicate matter through the orderly interference of energy waves. They store the blueprint of life and the life force. They're cosmic incubators. They're hyper-intelligent. They build hardware and assemble and process software life forms. They create bionic plants and biomachinery beneficial to human life. He also explains that they do this through holographic blueprinting, or imaging. He calls it hyperdimensional holograph. My husband and I decided a number of years ago, I first, because I only met my husband 2 years ago, that I would go forward and talk about this formula because Dr. G isn't comfortable to do it in our country right now until the FDA has approved all of his formulas. There was a state in our union that actually called the FDA in and said, we want to fund the INDs and whatever is necessary, and they were turned down. They said, no, an individual can do it, private agency can do it, but no agency of government can do it. So we are awaiting the approval, and some universities also have approved some of his other formulas and are working on the protocols as well as they are in Mexico and Canada and other countries. Right now, we have one formula of his that's been developed, which is called Life Everlasting. And neither my husband nor I have made any money personally off this development or sharing it with people. But we want you to have it because it's the thing that I find brings the most balance to individuals. It tastes like wine. It tastes like vintage port for those of you who've been to my booth and tried it. You really just want to drink the whole bottle. But you're only supposed to take 5 to 10 drops. If you take more than that, you won't need much sleep. And Dr. G wanted to show the other scientists that it increased your energy field to the point where you really don't need to sleep much. And he injected himself for a whole week, and he didn't have to sleep at all, not even 1 hour. Now, we don't offer the injectable form. We offer a form that has fruit juices and herb teas in it with the elixir. And you can see from what I've told you the reasons why I believe it is the same formula as St. Germain's. They found that it regenerates cells in the laboratory, even dead cells. It resurrects them. So I want to show you a couple of pictures on the videotape now, and then we'll have time for questions. I have to get where I can see the monitor. I told you about the bioenergy machines that are under the microscope, which are formed from the black proteins, communicate when they assemble each other in these forms to reproduce life itself in the form of the black proteins in the elixir. If we could have these two lights down here in front, I think we'll be able to see it a little better. Okay. Now we're beginning to focus in on the beginning of the assembling of the vortexes of energy under the microscope that will in a moment form into a bioenergy machine. And when you see little black spheres, those are the black proteins that develop out of the bioenergy machine. Now there's one. We're going to go back from it in a moment, and you can see it at a distance. Now he's showing several of them. This is the heart of the bioenergy machine with the black proteins in it. Could we have the two lights down up here, please, so we can see it a little better? There's one. See the bell jars? There's a very good picture of one. And the satellite dishes. Isn't that incredible? The one on top is black, the one on the bottom is white, and then there's the two side dishes, and each one has a different function. And he has cut them and taken them apart to discover what those functions are.
Two infinity symbols.
Yeah, they are like two infinity symbols, somebody just said here. They're actually like 4 cones put together.
Is it microscopic?
This is microscopic, yes. Now, I said to Dr. G, wouldn't it be possible to build a big one of these? And I wondered what we could do with that. Maybe regenerate whole organs and body parts, and I do think that's possible in the future. There it is. That's a really beautiful one. It's the cross. Those are all bioenergy machines, and here he's taken them apart, and the black proteins are coming out of them. I went to his laboratory to see all of these things, and over the last 10 years have followed his developments from the first microcrystals, the living crystals that were like the solar batteries to the development of the black proteins, or the smart proteins as they're called, and the bioenergy machines that can replicate life. In the future, perhaps even next year, we may get Dr. G to come back and talk to us more and tell you what he's into now. I think that's enough on that tape. If we could put the next tape in, I want to show you a few of the Sumerian seals. Dr. G discovered that while looking under his microscope as to how the life processes were being created and reproduced, that he recognized some of those things that he had seen in ancient Sumerian seals and other cultures as well. But he said the Sumerian seals were actually seals that came long before 4,000 years ago, and that they were a record, a visual record of how the angelic beings assisted God in creating life in the earth. So the same little things that look like badly drawn pictures of houses and animals and strange-looking people were really the tools and the bioenergy machines that were reappearing over and over again, and the black proteins that he was seeing under his microscope. I thought they were badly drawn too, but I knew there was something more to it. So he decoded the Sumerian seals. And from that, he has discovered indeed much more information about how the gods, or the angelic beings, created life in the earth. And he's carried on further with that. Now, can you put the next tape in? Okay. Let's start the next tape, and we'll see if we can take a quick look at some of these Sumerian seals. Do you have a remote that I can use, or do you need to run it? Okay. We'll let him run it, and I'll see if I can stand here and get a look at it for you. Okay, these are the seeds of life that appeared under the microscope. If you would go fast forward for me. They are the elemental seeds of life. A lot of people say, lotus buds in the ancient Oriental cultures represented life. They really weren't lotuses, they were seeds of life, and they appear in every culture. These also appeared under his microscope. There's a tradition among the Egyptians that the Ankh, which is the cross with the circle at the top, represents eternal life. And we know as a spiritual symbol, it certainly does represent the sphere, meaning the spirit or wholeness, and the cross at the bottom, representing bringing the spirit into matter, to make it very basic. But when I saw the bioenergy machine and the center of it looking like a pyramid, we do have pictures of it in one section of the tape where it opens up and forms an Ankh. So it became clear why it represented eternal life. It isn't just spiritual eternal life, which we also know that we have, but also the potentiality for physical eternal life. Just keep fast forwarding, because these are some of his drawings about how these forces coalesce together to form anti-gravitational force fields. There's the nuclear well, and from there to form matter, to compress light into matter. He has a lot of his physics formulas too on there, and he's gone far beyond E equals MC squared. This is some of the pictures of the coalescing of the four forces, counterclockwise and clockwise, and they interlock at 45 degrees. And this is some of the ancient tablets showing the same pictures. But I want to get you up to where the Sumerian seals are, beyond his drawings. Now, one of the reasons we can't have photographs of these anti-gravitational fields is because they're not all visible in this dimension. But I want to get you up to where the Sumerian seals are, beyond his drawings. Now, one of the reasons we can't have photographs of these anti-gravitational fields is because they're not all visible in this dimension. So one has to be spiritually astute or have some special internal equipment to be able to see what's going on in the other dimensions. And he does do that. Our science doesn't yet have the technology. Here's one of the microcrystals I described to you. You can keep going forward. We'll get to the Sumerian seals shortly. And these are some of the purified crystal forms. And they take on various forms, but basically it's tetrahedral as they're purified. In the beginning of the process, the microcrystals do look black, and then as they become more purified, they emit light, white light. Dr. G, okay, there's your bioenergy machine again. Keep going forward. We want to get to the Sumerian seals. Dr. G calls these things that you're going to see on the Sumerian seals that appear under his microscope the tools of the gods. The tools of the gods. And he says they were used in the macrocosm as well as in the microcosm to create life itself. I can't get into all the physics, and it's only by the grace of God that I've been able to comprehend as much as I have. And I thank heaven that I had a father who was a scientist who fed me Scientific Americans. Okay, is that them? No, keep going forward. You passed them? Okay, those are some of his plants set up with the Pyrex columns with the crystals growing in them. They're big. Yeah, if you would reverse it a bit, please. I think he has some on either side of that picture, though. Okay, let's stop for a moment, take a look at that. There's some of the Sumerian seals. And there's one of those Pyrex columns, just like his. I don't know if theirs were Pyrex, but anyhow, they had columns that they grew these elixirs in. Keep going forward, past the Pyrex columns. What they do is they collect the life force, or the solar energy, the lunar energy, the stellar energy, the neutrinos, and they condense it into a crystalline form. Okay, how much time do we have left? Because I want to be able to answer a few questions too. 10 minutes, okay. All right, there you are. Stop right there. Here's some of the Sumerian seals. And you can see these little things that look very poorly drawn, but actually they're things that appeared under his microscope while these crystals were forming and while these black proteins were forming. Okay, continue going forward, and he will show you them under the microscope as well. And you'll see over and over again on these images the Maltese cross forms, the onks, and many of the other things that appeared under the microscope. The bioenergy machines and the cosmic incubators. If we had time, I'd show you all of them, but I have several tapes of his that are not yet edited, or we'd be able to show this to you in a more organized fashion. That's another bioenergy machine. Now, he says that even the costumes and the dress designs on the drawings are like encoded with a textbook on physics. Back up just a second. See, there they are. There's some of the forms that you see drawn. That's under the microscope. You see them drawn over and over again in these seals of the Sumerians. Okay, I think we'll stop with that because I want to leave time for questions. I can show you over and over again hundreds of things that appear on the seals that also appeared under his microscope.
If people are wanting questions, please get over here as quickly as possible so we can get in as many as possible. Over here at the microphone, please. No questions from the audience. Please, over here at the microphone so everybody can hear them. Okay? Here's one. Yes.
The formula itself, is it open to a very reasonable price for the masses, or is it extraordinarily expensive?
No, it's not extraordinarily expensive. I guess I'm allowed to discuss that from here. There's several different forms. We carry one form, which is the most affordable. That is an oral form of the elixir for a 30-day supply. A bottle about this large. It's about the same price as good vitamins, $25. The price is going to go up next year, but after that, I think it'll start to come down because he'll have his plants set up by then. He won't have to do so much of the work by hand.
Without a microscope, how was Saint Germain privy to all of this material going on in the microscopic level?
I don't know whether Saint Germain did or did not have a microscope. I was absolutely amazed when I read Wolfgang Eisenbach's book, which was written, I think, back in the 1300s, of how they described a telescope that some of the kings and queens of that time period had in the Grail stories. They had telescopes, described as big glass that they would look through and see people miles away. So we don't know that some people didn't have microscopes. The other thing I will say about that is Dr. G is able to magnify living microbes under his microscope hundreds of thousands of times and way beyond what electron microscopes can do, and keep them alive. And the way he does this is with the polarized light that is produced by the little living crystals. So he has a way of lighting them up and keeping them alive, which our science isn't able to do under high magnification. Saint Germain was an alchemist and master adept, and I wouldn't doubt that he had some way of looking at these things. Whether it was spiritual or whether it was through a microscope, I can't tell you that. I didn't ask. Okay, any more questions?
Yes, please. My sense is, I'm just intuiting now, that perhaps this elixir gets us back to restoring the integrity of our original DNA, of our blueprint, and that the bodies we create are bodies that are already within us.
Yes. Could everyone hear that question? She asked about whether or not this brings us back to our original blueprint of our DNA. I believe it does. I think within each of us there is the potentiality for perfection, not only spiritually but physically within our DNA. Now, some of us, through what we would call karma or generations or miscreated energy, have mutated our DNA structure. Homeopathy helps even to eliminate some generations of past DNA miscreations. However, what will probably happen over a period of time of taking the elixir, Dr. G says, is he expects people to form multi-strand DNA. Who says we should only have double, single-strand DNA? Who says? Our science is so limited, it's nothing compared to the colossal knowledge that the other dimensions and the ancients had. We can form multi-strand DNA, which means that we will have a self-replicating, self-perpetuating system and live hundreds, if not thousands of years in good health. And yes, I do believe it's possible to reprogram our DNA to perfection. And this is a tool that can assist us in doing that. Any more? Yes.
Is there a reason for not revealing the name of Dr. G?
Yes.
Would you tell us what that reason is, please?
Yes. The reason is we want to protect him at this time. In the past, and I don't mean protect him from bodily harm, although that has happened to him too, to protect his identity for now until the FDA has approved his other formulas. I'm standing up here talking about what he's discovered. In the future, he'll be able to stand up here and talk about what he's discovered. And the only reason that he has offered this formula through the Heritage and through myself is because we trust each other, and also because we have on retainer some of the best law firms in America, in fact, the best law firms in America that deal with holistic health products. And they've told us what we can and can't say, can and can't write about his product, and particularly about the one formula that we are offering, which is not the same as some of the others that are in other countries. Also, I think that because he wasn't so wise in the legalities of what was allowed and permitted in our country, he ran into trouble with the FDA before. And until he is cleared in terms of operating freely, he had to divest himself of his company and give it to a member of his family. He couldn't publish his books. In order to do public speaking, he had to stop selling products, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. I suppose I could announce his name, and some of you are going to guess who he is anyhow. But for now, I'd prefer to just call him Dr. G. Yes?
Yes, are Dr. G's formulas available now in Mexico or elsewhere?
Dr. G's formula in the oral form, one of his formulas, we have here today. He has allowed the Heritage to offer it to the public in an oral form. And you have to hold it under your tongue for 5 full minutes, a minimum of 5 drops. You can take 15 if you wish for a therapeutic dose, and it's more than a vibrational vitamin. Like I said, it tastes like vintage port, and you want to drink the whole bottle, but it's, and you don't want to do that because you probably won't need any sleep. The other formulas that he's developed that are concentrated forms are in injectable form, and they are offered in other countries. So if someone you know has a really serious healing problem, crisis in their lives, or a serious disease, and time is of the essence, then let me know, and I'll put you in touch with doctors in other countries. You can take them to see them. Yes?
That was my question.
Okay.
If you had the names of the doctors in the other countries.
I do, and you can come back to my booth and I'll give you their numbers as well. I visited them personally and have experienced the injections myself, although I was not in serious ill health. I know a number of other people who were, and all of them had spectacular results. Yes?
How long does it last if you don't change your personal behaviors?
How long does the effect of the formula last if you don't change your personal behavior? One of the wonderful things about this is that I found that because you're bringing in the life force, the white light, most people, as far as we've tested so far, have experienced not only seeing the world more beautifully, releasing their anxieties and fears, and having attitudinal changes. They become more enlightened. So the formula isn't just a physical change, it's a spiritual change as well. Now, if one is really strong-willed and doesn't change at all, then that's another matter. You can always overcome any formula with your will. Thank you. Our time is up. And I'll be back in the back if you want to hear any more.
Oh, thank you, Nanette. I've been on